There we go.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. I see 8 of you here. Can you, as you come in, maybe some of you can let us know where you're coming in from in the chat. Oh, look at familiar faces. I mean, names. I don't see your faces. We're not going to do show all of the guests because Jared and I are going to pretend that we're just talking to each other. We know you're there, but we're going to have a little introvert conversation. So welcome. And oh, Minnesota, Squim, a neighbor. Yeah.
Really?
Oh, Jared's in Portland. We know that. I'm on Bainbridge Island. And it's been so nice actually through this last year and a half to have gotten a little more comfortable and adept with some of this technology. It's helped us really stay together. We've had some good FaceTime, not literal FaceTime, but we have somebody from Philadelphia. Let's see, 37, 38, lots of people are arriving. And
hi, Paula.
Oh, yay. And so Jared and I are here. He's at home in his workroom, and I'm in John's office because it's the tidy one. And John is here beside me, sort of standing by for any technical glitches and to slow me down if I start getting carried away. And we've got our cuppas. Do you have a cuppa, Jared?
I do.
You do? Good.
You're probably
good.
drinking tea, and I'm drinking espresso.
Oh, good for you. No, I'm drinking water actually, in case in case I choke. And we haven't seen each other for, well, like everybody else, more than a year and a half. And I'm really looking forward to when we can do that. I love coming to visit you, and I love having you here. We're having kind of our first maybe whiff of fall today. How about you?
It's wonderful.
I know. I mean, I don't want to wish.
I don't know if it's for real yet.
Right. I don't want to wish summer away because it's been such a lovely summer, and we've all gotten, I think, more accustomed to making ourselves go outside. So that's been really nice. And I think we're ready to start. We're at 10 o'clock. So lots of people have arrived. And first, I just want to say thank you, Jared, for coming and having a visit with us. And in particular, this was kind of motivated by the launching of your latest yarn, Tones. And you're now at 11 years as a brand, I believe.
Yeah.
And so I'm excited to talk to you about a little bit of that background. This is only our second webinar that we've done here, so bear with us if we have any little glitches. I know you are more accustomed to this. What we're going to do, just sort of in general, is we're going to start with introducing Tones and explore a little bit about what that's about. And then we're going to talk, ask Jared to tell us a little bit about his story and his background. We'll talk about how Brooklyn Tweed came to be. And if there's time, we'll talk a little bit about how we met and how we started collaborating. And hopefully at the end, we'll have time for some Q&A. But I also have to say that we've timed this for 90 minutes. And Jared, I don't think we've ever had a short call like that. In fact, when we started talking last night to just do a little, make sure all the technology was working, I think we ended up talking for an hour and a half. So
yeah, we did a half hour of work and then an hour of catching up.
Yeah. So we are warmed up, and hope everybody enjoys being in this visit with us. We're glad that you're here. First of all, just a tiny little bit of housekeeping. Everybody has paid a $10 registration fee, and you will get that back when you with your next purchase. And what you'll need to do when you check out is enter this code. John says closer. Jared and Kit. Yes, Jared and Kit. And the other thing is that the first 50 people who make a purchase will get a free Brooklyn Tweed pattern signed by Jared. And they're a really nice mix. So you'll get a surprise, but there are garments, there's cables, there's color work, there's texture, just a really nice representation. Some of my favorite BT patterns are in that stash. So that's exciting. And then when you make a purchase of tones, you will receive a free print version of Jared's new pattern that he developed with this yarn. And it's called the
First Raglan Sweater.
First Raglan Sweater. And I do want to say, though, it's a great first sweater project. It's also, I know that experienced knitters are going to be knitting it too, because it's kind of a blank canvas for anything you want to do on it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's exciting as well. So I guess the first thing to address is that as we've been, watching over these last couple of days, we've been seeing tones selling out everywhere. We still have a pretty good supply, but we're low and out of a few colors.
Yeah, so are we.
Yeah. And so I think the first thing I want to say, I was going to ask you, was this a surprise to you? And I know the answer because you wouldn't have done this on purpose. So it was a surprise to you. And you have a new shipment coming from the mill early December, and you've increased that order, right?
Yes, we just did.
Okay, good, because people are loving this. So I'm going to just ask you to launch in and start telling us about tones, how it came about. And I think you brought some images as well, a little slideshow.
I did, yeah. I've learned over the year doing some Zoom things that it's so much easier to prepare some photo slides for all of you attendees rather than holding up a skein here and trying to get you to see it. I mean, I'll do that too, but before I pop over and start my slideshow, I'll just say a little bit about what it's like for us at Brooklyn Tweed when we have a new yarn come out into the world. It's really a special time. We don't come out with yarns super regularly, 1 or 2 times a year. And these are usually projects that we've been working on anywhere from 1.5 years to 3 years, depending on the project and the supply chain and the relationships. And when I say starting, 2 years in advance, it's not necessarily that we're starting to spin the yarn 2 years before we sell it, but we are starting to build relationships. And if we have a new spinning relationship or dye house or scouring facility or rancher that we're working with, there's a lot of conversation and a lot of relationship building that we put in at the beginning to make sure that this is hopefully a relationship that we can continue to build upon and that will be sustainable and reliable for us. So we're very unique in our process of making yarn at Brooklyn Tweed in that we really make every yarn from scratch, and we kind of start with the fiber and build up from there. We're also committed to all of our production being done here in the US. So that's a pretty big constraint in terms of what kinds of spinning and fiber we have available to us. But I'm a big believer that constraints help creativity, and having a little bit of limitation to work against can sometimes help you come up with ideas you wouldn't have had if you had all the options in front of you from the beginning, which this yarn is a good example of that, which I'll talk a little bit about.
This chain that you're talking about, of sort of from conception to the knitter's needles, starts with the sheep, right? I mean, I don't want to say they're American sheep. Sheep aren't, American, but they live in the US, the sheep.
Yeah, in a lot of cases, they are breeds that have been developed or brought forward in the last 50, 100 years here in the country. So all the sheep that we're sourcing wool from, they are domestic ranchers and sheep that we're pulling wool from, but they of course have origins in other places in the world that are far more ancient than the US.
Right. Well, I also think that you've been really kind of instrumental, or you've been part of a movement to or sort of bring back the fiber and the spinning and all of that into America, because we did have historically a very robust fiber industry in the US, but you've really been, and I think that's going on in the UK as well. Young people are rolling their sleeves up and trying to bring back some things we've lost.
Yeah, it seems that there's a much, just in the 10, 11 years that I've been doing this, it does seem that there's more interest than there was, or at least more appreciation and understanding for provenance, product provenance. Where are things coming from? Who am I supporting? What am I buying? And customers really having a higher expectation around transparency from where their stuff's coming from and who they're supporting, which is beautiful. That's sort of what I hope for. I hope there can be more of that in our consumerist capitalist culture, where we aren't really taught to ask those questions. We're not really conditioned to think about where anything comes from. We just want convenience and cheap and what we want when we want it. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why I've always been drawn to this industry rather than translating my skills to a ready-to-wear clothing line or designing fabrics and things like that for the ready-to-wear market, just because there's so much more understanding of intentionality and the slowness of what we do, and how that just is a kind of a built-in appreciation for the things that we put on our back, and the fibers that keep us warm and comfortable and safe. And so all of those concepts really resonate with me kind of in terms of my personal values. And I just don't see a way to sort of feel that way by entering into an industry that there's really not very much room for that.
Yeah. I mean, I think some brands are starting to embrace that. When I was at the Mill show in Italy a couple of years ago, I was really intrigued that virtually every one of these kind of industrial spinner booths really had a presence and at least signage about sustainability and ecology. So if more and more people are embracing it, certainly some of them will be greenwashing, but if even half of them are really, truly, sincerely caring for the planet and how they do their industry, that will be a better thing. I've also really appreciated right out of the gate from your very first yarn, which is still one of our best loved yarns, that the yarns you create really have good long legs. I mean, they move forward, they don't become obsolete. When you knit out of them, that you're going to love that piece 10 years later, 20 years later, you might hand it down. So I think that in itself speaks to not being consumerist in a way that, these things we're going to mend them, we're going to darn them, we're going to just keep on wearing them. We'll repair them.
Knitting. So I grew up in a knitting household. My mom is a master knitter, and we grew up wearing homemade clothes, whether that was on the sewing machine or my mom knitting us these, what at the time were intolerably scratchy sweaters. And now I look back at them with such nostalgia and love.
Now we've toughened up.
But I have such a emotional attachment and a nostalgia around knitting and wool and natural fibers just from my own life. But I think Kit, you and I are both lovers of British traditions of knitting and wool production and yarn making. And when I first was thinking about if I was going to make a yarn, what would I care about, what would I want, is a yarn that feels like this could have been a beautiful yarn that was made 100 years ago, or it could be a beautiful yarn that someone was still wanting to make 100 years from now. And that's sort of always been my philosophy around the yarn design and yarn making, but also the what we end up designing for the knitwear with those yarns is not trying to think about what's going to still have longevity, what will still be appealing to people to be making, even if it's 10, 15, 20 years later. And some of our best-selling patterns are at this point a decade old, and they're still going strong. And that's such a rewarding thing for me to see, because that's sort of how I conceived of everything when we started. So I hope that continues. Granted, we're also very invested in what's happening in the world today, and I'm very inspired by design and culture and just current conversation. And I'm a photographer and an image maker, so I'm very much engaged with a visual conversation of now as well, and kind of bringing these two things together, modern and traditional, has always been a huge driving sort of force for me personally as an artist, but also in the brand and the business that we've built over the years.
I think you've done that really well. I mean, everything you do has a sort of a nod to tradition, but also has a modern aesthetic to it. And even the name Brooklyn Tweed is, on the one hand, urban, and we'll get a little more into that history later, but on the one hand has this kind of urban edge to it, and Tweed is obviously a landscape with sheep on it, I mean, so it's really a beautiful balance of those two places in the world. So let's talk about tones, and then we're going to swing back a little later and do a little bit of compare and contrast between tones, which is a worsted weight, and your original yarn Shelter, which is a worsted weight. Talk a little bit about the difference between the two, but let's start with tones.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen here and put a little slideshow up so everybody can see what we're referring to. Is that visible for you, Kit?
Yes.
All right. So this is our new yarn Tones. We released it on Wednesday this week, and it's been a project in the works for a good year and a half in earnest. The big kind of thing about this yarn is that it's an over dyed yarn, and that's a specific kind of dye process that we've never done before at Brooklyn Tweed, and that had been kind of on my short list of things I wanted to play around with and experiment with in future yarn projects. So when this yarn came up on our project list, that was kind of the main thing we wanted to explore at first. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about how this yarn is made, and then we can talk more about how we use it or other questions you or other folks might have. But so the unique thing about this yarn, one color, two shades, is sort of how we're talking about it, is that an over dyed yarn is different from the two kinds of dye processes that we have done in the past. So there's a heathered yarn, which I know you love, Kit, which is a dye process where all the wool is dyed as raw wool in colors. So you might dye 6 or 7 colors of just raw wool. And then
they're not really great colors in and of themselves, which is really startling.
Yeah, because you're going to be taking a little bit of every color and blending it together to make a heather. And in order to maintain a kind of a certain intensity of hue, once you're mixing all those colors together, you really need to start with colors that are pretty bright and garish, not colors I would normally want to be in the finished yarn, but they actually are really effective in making a really beautiful heathered yarn. So that's a stock dyed process where you're dyeing the wool and then you're blending it like paint colors to get a finished product. The other type of yarn that we've made in the past is solid yarn, which is the most common thing to see in the industry, which is all of the yarn spun with white wool, and then you're just dipping those skeins in a dye bath to get a perfectly solid color. So what over dyeing does—
That's Peary and Arbor, right?
Yeah, Peary and Arbor are both done that way in our line. And the over dyeing process is kind of a blend of the two dye processes, because we make a heathered yarn first, and then we dip that yarn in color. So you're sort of overlaying color on top of in this case, gray heathered yarn. And so with tones, what we did is we made two bases. We made a darker gray heathered base and a lighter gray heathered base. but we put both of those bases in the same dye bath so that every color you get in the line actually pulls out with two colors, one that's bright and light, and then another that's a little bit more subdued as well. And you can kind of see here on my first slide, I've got them all lined up together. So you see these four yellows here are actually two different colors, but the sort of darker, little more muted one is the darker base, and the lighter, brighter one was the same color dyed on the lighter base. So here's an example of the two bases that we have, and I actually have these here as well, which I can hold up later when I'm on screen again. But we take the step one is that we blend a natural white wool, and then we also dyed a portion of wool black, so stock dyeing. And we blend those colors together to make these two base yarns, what we call the baseline overtone and the baseline undertone. And then we dip those two into the same dye bath so that you get this corresponding pair of colors that starts to open up a lot of really fun, creative ways to play with the yarn in multiple color projects. Mm-hmm. And so here's an example of, on the left, some overtone, the lighter colors dyed over that lighter base, and the darker colors dyed over the darker base. Mm-hmm. And then our palette here with 12 colors total. Technically, from a production perspective, we have a palette of 12 colors, but from a finished yarn perspective, we have a palette of 24, which is also really lovely, because my challenge in my work a lot of the time is to choose the small, the amount of colors that we can afford versus the amount of colors that I actually would love to put in a palette in my idealized world. So this was a really beautiful solution, because we got to pay for 12 and we got 24, and that was a nice compromise between some of the business constraints of starting a new yarn line and some of the creative desires that I have from the artistic side. Mm-hmm.
Beautiful.
And so some of the ways you can play with the color are to match, to take that overtone lighter and the undertone darker of the same color to get some kind of more of a tonal effect, like you see here on this hat we did, the brim in the under and the cables in the over. You can also combine overtones and undertones from different colors, and that will kind of guarantee that you're getting this value relationship. What I mean is value is the lightness and the darkness of colors. And that's actually one thing that I'd like to talk about. Maybe you can pull me back to that topic when I'm done with the slideshow, because a lot of times when people are choosing colors for projects, they're really thinking about the colors that they like and what colors put together. But the most important topic, or the most important thing to consider when you're putting colors together in yarn is the values. Is it a light color or a dark color? And am I choosing a balance of those things, regardless of what their actual hue is?
Right.
So that was another kind of geeky thing we built into this palette to try and enable people to have success combining colors without needing to do a lot of thinking about it.
Right. A couple of little tips that I have been told around that, the values is, one is to squint, that really kind of helps you see whether it's a light, a mid, or a dark. And the other was to lay your colors out on a copier and make a black and white copy. That can also kind of help you with that process.
Yeah, you can also take a picture of them on your cell phone and flip it to black and white for the same effect of the copy machine.
Of course, because who has a big copy machine? Yeah.
Well, you guys do.
Well, we do, but that wasn't a very helpful tip for most people. So thank you for bringing me modern. Yeah.
And then as far as, so the color is really, the color and the dye process is really kind of the driving force behind the yarn. But then of course we've got yarn construction, geeky things to talk about as well. This is a woolen spun yarn. So it's a type of fiber prep that keeps a lot of air in the fiber. So it makes for lighter, warmer, a little bit fluffier feel hand to the finished yarn.
Mhm.
It's also a 3-ply construction, which is important because a 3-ply, to talk a little bit about the physics of yarn, the number of plies that are in any given yarn is going to affect the behavior of that yarn in the finished fabric. So if you were to look at a 3-ply yarn, if you were to cut it in half, you have, like, if my fingers are the plies here, you have this sort of triangle shape. The 3 plies are sort of in this triangular cross section, and that creates a really round yarn that is very, very good for stitch definition. So we included this picture here of one of our reknits of one of our past shawl patterns that has a lot of just juicy, juicy texture in it. And this yarn just sings in this kind of a thing, as you can see from the photo. That 3-ply construction gives those textured stitches and cables an incredible kind of cut appearance in the finished fabric. But because it's a woolen spun yarn, it still maintains some of that light, lofty feeling. It doesn't create really heavy garments. And that's a theme in my yarn work, is just never having the yarn feel heavy and dense, but trying to really get that spin specification dialed so perfectly that you get this nice balance of durability, but also wearing a fabric that you might not normally find in ready to wear, even hand knit fabrics, because things tend to skew on the heavier side when you're spinning things for durability. So that's kind of the specs of the yarn from a construction perspective.
It also kind of feels, with that more air in the yarn, it feels like it's a little bit easier to wear it as an indoor or an outdoor garment.
Yeah, it does have
It
really
will be
good.
kind of warm if you need it, but because it'll trap your body heat, but it'll also stay kind of cool if you're inside. Yeah,
definitely.
Will you be talking? I keep interrupting you. Will you be talking at all about the fleece itself?
Oh yes, yeah.
Okay.
Definitely. We can talk about that too. I'll show you real quick. We did a couple patterns for this yarn. I can talk more about the sweater in a little bit. Here's one new pattern from me that we designed for the yarn. And we did also a cabled hat here that one of our team members at Brooklyn Tweed designed with the yarn. And so we've got those 2 new patterns, which are really good for this yarn as kind of a getting to know you kind of pattern experience.
Nice.
And we've got here some more of the specs. So this is a Columbia wool that we sourced from Wyoming. Columbia is a medium wool. So one of the challenges, or one of the goals that I have when working with a medium wool versus a fine wool is more what you see in European yarns and yarns that are spun over on the other side of the pond, where softness is really kind of the main goal. And I really like the challenge of making medium wools, challenging people's assumptions about medium wools based on the way you handle them. So I would say this is a medium wool that doesn't feel it feels a little more like a fine wool because of the spinning process that we've done, allowing that air to be captured in the prepped fiber and the plies that you're making when you're spinning the yarn. Allows for that hand and that kind of feeling of the wool, the original wool, to maintain itself all the way through. And that's another thing that we think about a lot at Brooklyn Tweed, is how can we treat this fiber in a way that is going to be true to it and kind of harness its innate qualities. So beautiful that there are so many types of wool and they all have different qualities and can be harnessed in different ways to make different fabrics. So that's a very big part of our whole mission with yarn making, is really keeping it as close to the natural start as possible. And I feel that this yarn does that really, really well.
I was surprised actually when I got my hands on the first skein that I touched, and then also having knit with it and blocked it. I was surprised at how soft that finish feel is, because it looks very toothy. It looks very rustic in a way, but it's the finish is almost a little, I don't want to say felty, but it's it's lovely.
It has a little bit of a halo in that finished fabric.
Yes.
Yeah. It's really really nice. I agree. When we first finished all of our spinning tests, we were thinking this is softer than we thought it would be, starting with the 24 micron Columbia.
Yeah.
So it's
No,
also it's a longer staple too, so it's soft but durable, which is a beautiful
and
combo.
the Columbia wool is also one of the components of Shelter and Loft. Is that right?
So Shelter and Loft are spun from a crossbred fleece, which is a Targhee Columbia cross. A Targhee wool is a finer wool than Columbia. It's a 21 micron wool. So it is actually.
So the sheep is crossed. It's not a blend of two. The sheep is crossed.
Exactly. Yeah. So we're taking the actual sheep is a Columbia Targhee cross. So it has a micron count that's a little finer than this one. But they started as two separate breeds, and a crossbreed was formed, and also the wool characteristics of those two were blended. So
this is one of the ancestors.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this is just a little infographic of the sheep to skein process for this yarn. So we've got our little sheep up here, Columbia purebred, breed specific Columbia wool that we source out in Wyoming. We send the wool to Bowman Industries down in Texas, which is where we scour all of our woolen spun yarns. That's the only scouring plant remaining in the US that can prep woolen spun fiber. So they're a very important business to us and many other companies that are doing wool processing in the US. And once that wool is scoured, it goes up to Philadelphia here, where we do that base dyeing. So we dip dye a big batch of the wool into the black, and then we keep the rest of it as white. And that's what we're going to send over to the mill to spin the two base yarns. Just down here, we work with a mill in Crescent Woolen Mill, which is in Wisconsin. I don't know if we have any Wisconsin folks here in the chat, but this yarn was spun very close to you.
Kathy
Wright in Green Bay.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
And so we've got the yarn made, and at that point, it's just these two bases here, the light and the dark.
Our two favorite colors.
And then we send it up to Caledonian Dye Works in Philadelphia. And that's a dye house we've been working a lot with in the last few years. It's, I think, 4th or 5th generation, really wonderful people, really committed to keeping this operation going. And they dip dye those two bases into the colors. And another nearby partner of ours, Clemson Winding, also in Philadelphia, they'll take the yarn from the dye house, twist it into the skeins that we know and recognize from the yarn store shelves. And they'll also put our label on it and then ship it all back to us in Portland. And that's back to the mothership. And that's where we ship it out to stores like yours, or directly to customers who are ordering online and shipping right to their door. So that's sort of the path.
That's the path. And the thing that I can't help thinking about when I look at this, because I've seen some of your other videos, I think they're in your blog on your website, is I can't help but thinking about the hands and the faces of all the people, because any one of these skeins that we receive in our hand, yep.
And there you go. It's like you perfectly transitioned.
I teed you up. Yeah. I mean, it's wonderful all the way along that it's and not to mention the sheep and the shepherd.
It's really, it's been a learning process for us over the years to realize how important it is for us to tell that story about what we do, because it is really unique to us that we do have so many people working on this yarn here in the country that no one ever really thinks about if we're not showing them photos or talking about the facilities that they go through. And like I was saying earlier, we're so accustomed to just that thing on the shelf is just on the shelf. We don't know,
like it magically appeared.
Yeah, or who supported it, and what businesses were involved in making that thing a thing. So I thought it would be fun to include some of those people in the slideshow today. You can see this is Ricky, Will, Angel, and Pedro. These guys all work at the stock dyeing dye house in Philadelphia, JG Littlewood and Sons. We've been working with them for 11 years, and they are absolutely amazing. This is a dye house that is right on the river, right outside of Philadelphia, and it's literally built into like a blown out cliff in the side of a stone wall, like half of the dye house is a cliff indoors, which I think is
Wow.
really cool. But
Wow.
you can see behind the guys here, there's a big black blob coming up out of this
Oh,
dye vat, and that is the dyed black wool that we use to blend to make those
it
base
becomes that.
solids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
And
And
so the stock dyeing operation here, it looks very different from a skein dyeing operation, because these dye vats are big circular, like giant soup pots that can fit, 200, 400, 500 pounds of wool all in one bath at a time.
mhm. Wow. I also really appreciate, and I think this has something to do with keeping it all within the United States as well, is that you are doing everything as best you can and working with people who are doing as much as they can to be environmentally sound, fair trade,
Yeah,
respecting the workers and all of that. And I think it probably is a little easier to do that when you can go meet them. I mean,
exactly.
you've
Yeah,
walked into these spaces, you and Luigi visit these places and
yeah. And
have a
that's
good,
part of that initial sort of relationship stage building. If we're working with someone new, we go meet them and we go see the facility and meet the people on the floor and kind of just get a feel for that business. And we're lucky that I think we're lucky that because textile industry in the US is so difficult to maintain a business within, that the people that still are have some kind of connection to the kind of product they're making. It's not, hey, this is the most lucrative manufacturing job we could have in the US, so that's why we're doing it. Usually these businesses are multi-generation, and there's some kind of tie to the past about wanting to keep this as a service that's available in the country. And for the most part, in almost all cases, I would say quality and kind of reputation around maintaining this manufacturing capability that in some cases has been going for 50, 60, 100 years at some of these places, that is one of the driving forces for them. That is one of the factors for them. And that's really cool and unique, not
and
very common.
also keeping this livelihood within these communities as well, I think is a good thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
most of these facilities, with the exception of some of the Philadelphia manufacturers, are in more rural towns, smaller towns that were traditionally towns built around these kind of industries, and no longer are. A lot of them are really depressed, struggling places right now, and the mills tend to be a place where local people have been able to keep good jobs for long periods of time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is just some of the team at Littlewood that
Yeah.
was dying the day that we were there. We got some other, this is Chico. He works the blending machine at Crescent Woolen in Wisconsin. So this is that wool behind him you see is the white wool that's getting ready to be blended with the black wool before they spin it into yarn.
Is that a bit of an art form, keeping that the proportion and the mix?
The proportion is all done by weight, but
Okay.
what's an art form is getting the efficiency from the machinery. So having that machinery kind of hit that sweet spot where it might be able to process 90 pounds of yarn if you put 100 pounds of fiber in. There's always about an amount of waste, but how well you're able to understand and operate the machinery has a pretty big effect on how much usable material you get afterwards.
Yeah. Very skilled. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's highly skilled labor, and also not labor that you can learn anywhere in a trade school. You can pretty much learn it in the mill if you're studying with someone who's been doing it for 15 years, then you're coming up underneath, which is another real threat to the industry right now. There's not a lot of young people who are like chomping at the bit to get into these mills and have these jobs. So it's been interesting watching each of our manufacturing partners kind of deal with that challenge in different ways. Some of them are having new generations in their own families kind of coming up and taking the reins, and others that have new generations but who are not really interested in taking on the family business, and trying to find other people in the community that might be able to come into those facilities and work and really be counted on for kind of long-term careers.
So all you young people and parents in who are our guests, get your kids into this. It looks like a good life, you know?
This is the dye house, the second dye house in Philly, the Caledonian Dye Works. This is my husband Luigi on the left, and my partner in crime at Brooklyn Tweed, co-owner, and a big reason why we're able to do everything that we're able to do. Luigi's sort of the behind the scenes face of Brooklyn Tweed more than I am. People know me associated with the brand, but he is my other half in every way. So he does a lot of relationship building, a lot of traveling. He's out there a lot with our manufacturers, and he's an Italian and very social. And one of his great strengths is relationship building and people. And it's a good match for me because I like to be home in this room alone, thinking creatively and reading and drinking tea and not seeing people.
I think we both really lucked out in our husbands. And also that they were willing to come on this journey with us and make it possible. You know, really a blessing.
So
for sure.
Kim and Rick Fitch are multi-generation owners and operators of Caledonian Dye Works. Kim is Rick's daughter. She is now the president and CEO of the dye house. And Rick, I'm going to use air quotes, retired a few years ago, but that man can't stay away from the dye house. And it's just an amazing example of someone who's spent their life pouring all their energy into this business. And you can really see his love and commitment to it, even at an age where he really should now be going and enjoying non-professional life.
But then he's going to have to get rid of that shirt because if he puts that shirt on, he has to go into the dye house.
I tell him that he's really on trend with wearing his jumpsuit. Like, people actually want to wear those for fashion now, and he doesn't believe me. But you can see they're standing in front of a batch of hollyhock, this color on the left that you see that's coming out of the dye bath. You can see between Luigi and Kim, the yarn is sort of dripping down into the dye bath as it comes out. And so both of the base colors are coming out of the same dye bath at the same time. And Joan here is Joan and her husband Bill in Philly are, if you've ever knit with a Brooklyn Tweed skein of yarn, any of our worsted spuns or tones, they have been hand labeled and hand skeined by this woman or her husband Bill. They have a spinning, twisting business, also a multi-generation business in Philly, and that's all they do. And they're amazing people. And we couldn't do this without them either. So we asked Joan to send us a picture of herself with a stack of tones when she was doing the first batch of yarn for us. So we could give props to them too, because that's an important part of this too. Yeah. Wonderful. And then our yarn inspector at the dye house here, we can just throw a picture of Stinky in as well.
Good job.
Cheap shot. I know knitters love cats. So So that's a kind of a really brief overview of the yarn, how it's made and the process that it goes through. There's a question I see in the Q&A about how does a yarn get around the country in trucks. It's we use freight companies that drive from one city to the other. So I'm always wondering if I'm ever out on a road trip and I'm driving by a truck, if there's any yarn in there. But all of our nothing travels by air or train. It's all on the roads. So again, more hands. The hands on the wheel are part of your yarn as well. Yep. Yeah. Yep. That's many hands touching these yarns before they get to the yarn shop shelf. Well, and then the next pair of hands on it is ours, the knitting community. And I've been really enjoying watching how other yarn stores, yarn businesses have been embracing it and what they've been doing with it and how they're presenting it when they're launching it. And I wondered if we could just do a little brainstorm around what are some, I mean, I know you're probably sitting in there that you've thought of 3,000 things you can do with these yarns, but maybe we could just bat around a few ideas. Yes, let's do it. Well, that was the thing about this yarn project that ended up being such a fun inspiring thing for me creatively was that we're doing what we always do, which is making something high quality and beautiful. That's always a requisite for me. But we're also we're building in this little miniature structure with the color into the yarn that is giving people a little bit of help in being creative with playing with color. And playing with color is one of the best parts of knitting, I think.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot over the years at Brooklyn Tweed about teaching people color theory and how to understand, just the sort of basic concepts of color theory when you're making color work sweaters, or even just striping something, or making color work yokes, or a 2-color stitch pattern or something, how to think about color from a kind of scientific standpoint before you start bringing it together in the palette. And like I was saying earlier, value, the lightness or the darkness of a color is the most important thing. When you're putting 3 colors together, rather than saying, oh, I want to put an orange, blue, and a yellow together, the first thing you should ask is, oh, I want to be putting a light, a medium, and a dark together. And then whatever colors those are, I've got this built-in contrast to the colors that it is going to be successful. I think maybe a lot of colorwork knitters have probably had the experience where they choose colors that they really, really like, and they start knitting, and that motif is just not very crisp. It doesn't really come.
Absolutely.
And you spend all that work. Spend all that work and time to make this beautiful patterning, but it's not really visually translating in the finished product. So as an educator, one thing that I loved about this yarn is we're sort of building in a value relationship for you. And I like one of my favorite ways to combine color is in a more kind of tonal relationship, sort of having similar colors that come together to create more painterly effects. I'm a painter before I was ever a knitter or a photographer, and a lot of my background, I have a bachelor's and a master's in painting, basically, from art school, and so a lot of my yarn making background comes out of that. And I think about it a lot in the same way as I do if I'm mixing colors and making paintings. So this felt so much like a painting project to me, because the palette looks very painterly, and you can be choosing these tone pairs and mixing them together and getting these really beautiful kind of tonal painterly effects with a little help from the starting point.
Right. I was also thinking, because you also have the photographic background, and there is something about those sort of half tones and that you're playing with as well, right? So, and then also it crossed my mind that you and Luigi both have a very musical background. Luigi is and was a practicing opera singer, and now he teaches, I believe, and you're a singer as well. And I wondered if that sort of musical tonality plays into this at all. Are there major keys and minor keys here? Is there a sort of a are you playing with dissonance, or am I stretching too far?
I don't think so. Music is a huge part of my life, and that's not something a lot of people know, because I'm not sort of out there talking about myself as a musician, really. But we're both singers. We both play piano and other instruments, and so harmony is something I think about also, and visually a lot. And with color and value and color relationships really do have a lot of parallels with kind of the structure of music as well. So it's funny you asked this question specifically about this yarn, because I really agonized over naming a yarn.
I know. Yeah.
We probably overthink it. But when we were first really in the middle of this development process, when the yarn project was really cloudy and kind of coming together, and we didn't have a really clear idea of what it would be in the end, we were talking about yarn names, and I had this word overtone in my head. It was a word that I really like. Most people think of overtone in the meaning of the word that's more common, which is sort of like, what's the implied meaning here? What's the overtone of this conversation, or this this event. But in music, I'm a choral singer, so I'm a total choir nerd. I love singing with choir, sing with a choir here in Portland. And in music, an overtone is if you're singing with people and you're so perfectly in tune with each other. This happens a lot in early Renaissance music, that all the singers, all the notes are so perfectly in tune with each other that you get what's called an overtone, which is a note that nobody is singing, but you hear above everything else. It's
So
like
it's a blend.
Yeah. And so I was like stuck on this idea with my team saying like, you guys, I love this word. And they're saying, yeah, but most people don't think of that when they hear that word. We ended up getting the word in after all, because we were thinking, well, I also like the word undertone as well. And then we thought, well, if we have these two lighter, darker, why don't we call those? And then we just call the yarn tones. And shockingly enough, there wasn't a yarn already named that, which I was pretty sure there would be, but there wasn't. So that was a fun kind of process for us to try and think about how using words and the name of the yarn to reinforce this idea that we had.
Yeah. So any thoughts about really expanding the cord to, one darker or one lighter, or?
Would love to do that. Would really love to do that. One of the funny, so I've never done over dyeing before. This is my first time working with a dye house with this process. And so I approached it with a lot of curiosity. And in fact, the concept that we ended up with the overtone, undertone, light and dark with every single color was one of those beautiful, happy accidents that happens when you're in the creative process and you're just like, I don't really know what this is going to be yet, but you have that light bulb moment in the middle. That's how this happened for me. So my yarn production director, Stephanie Engel, she is the woman responsible for making all of our yarns happen. She manages all of our supply chain partners and all of our inventory and projections and ordering. She's just incredibly amazing at what she does. And she and I work really closely together at the very beginning when we're really just putting together a yarn concept. And she and I were sitting down really early on, and I was saying, Stephanie, I'm really interested in over dyeing, but I don't know what to expect. Normally what I do when I'm dyeing yarn is I'm grabbing fabric swatches or yarn swatches, anything with a color that I like that we're going to be able to send to the dye house and have them try to match on the finished yarn. And usually they're dyeing a white yarn. So I send a color to them and the yarn that I get back, if they did a good job, is the same. But in this case, it was, here's the color you pick, but you need to sort of predict the two shades that will come back that are going to be different than the one you send. One's going to be a little darker and one's going to be even more dark than that. And so this was, I struggle with control issues. So when I'm doing a palette, I really like to know like what I'm going to get back. And so I started really overthinking the process when I first started, which was picking a color I was going to send, but then also sending a color what I thought was going to be coming back on the lighter and thought was going to be coming back on the darker. And it just got way too complicated for me. And so I thought, you know what, we're going to simplify this. I'm going to choose colors that I like and just ask the dye house to dye that same color on two bases, just so I can get kind of a baseline understanding of what happens with one color when you're dyeing it on two grays.
Just see what happens.
The thought was we'll get two colors back for every color we send, and then we'll just cherry pick, like, do we like the lighter one, do we like the darker one, and we'll build the palette from there. So 3 or 4 weeks pass. Usually it's about a month when we send colors out to Philadelphia to the dye house and they come back. 3 or 4 or 5 weeks pass and we get a shipment from the dye house and open the box, and there's all of the cards with the yarn reelings that come back, and they're all in pairs. And they were sitting on a card, the darker and the lighter together, and I laid them all out. And I was like, this is what we have to do. This is perfect. It's beautiful. This is so much better than the idea that I had at the beginning, because it allowed for this kind of painterly gradation across a palette with a pretty limited number of colors. Honestly, it's hard to get a really nice complex feel to a palette with just 12 colors. And you have those colors right behind you, and you can kind of see row 1 on the left is bright, row 2 is a subdued version, row 3 is bright, and row 4 is a subdued version. So that was a happy accident that then we built the rest of the development process on that. And so a lot of the yarn colors that we ended up sending were good on one, but not on both. And so that was another change. Was we did a second round of dyeing, because now that I had seen all of that come in, I had to think, okay, well, we've got some great golds, but we're light on the greens or light on the blues, and the blues that I thought would be working well just didn't translate to both yarns.
Got it.
So there is another constraint with this project, is that you need to choose a dye color that actually translates well to both of those bases. And I had a couple colors that on one base I was just obsessed, on the other one I was not liking it as much, so I had to kind of let those go.
Well, and I was kind of interested that some of the pairs are, I would say, nearer to each other, and other pairs are more contrasting. Well, you talked about sort of constraints being a helpful facet of the creative process, and I completely agree with you. Otherwise, it's like everything, you could do everything, you know, and it's really easy to get out of focus. But also that that other part, like you were describing, of staying open, staying curious, being prepared to accept some happenstance, and that you didn't necessarily invent, but you discovered. So I think that both of those things, I think, are really important in the creative process. I was also really surprised, and I'm not sure at what point I kind of figured this out. It might have been with your slideshow, but I assumed that the two colors you were dyeing over were natural colors, natural grays, off the sheet grays or something.
Oh.
And I didn't realize that you had actually created that gray.
Yeah.
And I think we both sort of have this love of gray woolly wools. And for example, when you created the first palette for Shelter, and I saw the palette, it was like, I got it right away. And I was like, oh yeah, this is Jared. You know, it made perfect sense to me. And when I saw this, you know, 10, 11 years later, I thought, wow, I wonder how he dealt with this kind of brightness and lightness, what that was like for him as a creative process. And then I realized that all the colors were over a little gray. You know, I thought it was a cream and a gray, but it's not. It's a light gray and a slightly darker gray. So gray is in everything. It's all slightly grayed, which I think makes it more complex and interesting.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's funny. My kind of favorite place with color is nature's colors. I love colors that are complex, but they are a little bit more grayed out, if you will, like the color. I mean, obviously we see beautiful bright colors in nature and flowers and a lot of other plants, but when you're looking at a landscape in any of my favorite places in the world, it's this beautiful mix of complexity of color. And that is really where all of the heathered yarns sort of came from, my love of those kinds of colors and that kind of complexity of color in nature. And so over the years, just personally, I've embraced color in a different way in my own wardrobe and my own life. And I think it partially is just becoming more comfortable with who you are and being comfortable wearing whatever color you feel is expressing whatever you feel and you want to be saying in your clothing. And so
I'm working on that.
I do.
I'm a little behind you there.
I do have a love for gray and neutrals, and it's strong, and it will always be strong. But I've also grown in my love of brighter colors over the years. And the great thing about this project that was another bonus was you kind of got to do both. I didn't have to make that call between do we go with the brighter one or the more subdued one. You got both, and that is one of the parts of palette development for more of our standard style yarns that is really hard for me is we only have maybe 2 spots for a gold. And do we want to do one that's a really bright, loud color and one that is going to be more subdued and a little more neutral inspired? And so with this project, got the best of both worlds, and that was really, really exciting.
So let me segue here a little bit, back up a little bit to shelter, and maybe do a little bit of a comparison between the two. But first, I want to ask whether could you? I know that they're designed to be interchangeable in terms of all your designs and patterns that were created for shelter can be used for tones.
Yep.
Can you mix the two together? Could you do a yoke in tones and the body in shelter? Could you do color work using, getting some of those murky shades mixed in with these? What have you been playing with?
We haven't done a lot of that yet, but you can. They're gauge interchangeable. There's a different hand to the finished fabrics of both. Yeah. But mixing them together wouldn't create a weird fabric at all. It would just give you more color options to play with, which would be great.
They're both woolen spun and both,
they're both woolly yarns. There's a noticeable difference in the kinds of fabrics that each really shine in. The biggest difference between the two would be the ply structure and how much twist is in the yarn. Shelter was and is a very, very lightly spun yarn. It was sort of how far can we push it to be this really light, airy yarn that still holds together and still is worth knitting with and good to knit with. And a 2-ply is a much more relaxed yarn. So it's really, really great for sweaters that you want to have that really light, lofty feel that are going to be light in weight, but keep you warm. And it's going to have a little bit more of a soft finish if you're doing it in texture, like cables or knit purl texture. Particularly the smaller the texture, the softer it would be in shelter. And tones is with that 3-ply that we talked about, and also there's more twist. It's a little bit has a little more of a structured feel to it. You get these, you still get that woolly feeling of a woolen spun, but these cables and the texture. I have some swatches here. You can just kind of see how sculptural they are and how much definition you get. But this is still really light. So these were some swatches that I was doing with tones before we had any dyed yarn, when we just had the bases to start playing around with and testing. You can see some moss stitch. There's some Guernsey patterns in here and some cable textures, some lace and texture patterns here. This is kind of a scrunched brioche stitch. You got this nice texture here. So you can really see even on Zoom how much those textures really pop. I'm knitting a sweater for myself right now that this isn't a pattern yet, but it's just something that I'm making for myself. But you can see this beautiful texture that is just twisted stitches. So it's just a single traveling stitch, but it really pops. And looks really, really good.
I like that it's, you told me that it's for gardening, and I like that it has that sort of trellis fence kind of
you got it.
Nice, really nice.
I'm a gardener. I love fall gardening, especially because I love fall. It's my favorite season. So usually when we get a new yarn, I want to knit myself a sweater out of it ASAP. And this year, last year in the fall, I was thinking, I really need a good sweater that was particularly designed for gardening. Not very long sleeves, nothing's going to fall in the way, but keeps me cozy, big pockets, really utilitarian.
Pockets.
And so this is going to be that sweater for me this year. Nice. And this stitch pattern, reminded me of like a trellis or some kind of garden pattern. So so the yarn is really, really great for texture.
I noticed that we both chose the same color. I did our Windy City hat. And what was interesting to me is the yarns that it was done originally in were worsted weight, as this is, but I had to go down at least one needle size to get it condensed. because it has
Mhm.
this sort of spring and loft. And so to get it condensed and kind of windproof, which is the idea behind this, I think this is on a 3.75. That's a 5, a US 5.
Yeah,
So it's
and
really
that's a pretty
condensed.
dense fabric by the
It is.
pattern, right? You
Yes,
wanted
it's
it
the
to be
tweed
really,
stitch. Yes, the tweed stitch. And then of course, when I blocked it, it just,
yeah.
became, yeah, fabulous.
I see there's a question here from Joseph about the gray bases, if they're available. They are available. So they're in the palette. We call them baseline. That's the color. And so you can be working with just the gray. The sweater that I did, the first version of the sweater I did is in the base, the lighter base.
Mhm.
So this is the color that this is dyed over, for example.
Yeah. I had also asked Jared, I keep kind of poking him, but I would love to have the tones yarn done in the two, not the undertones, but the two base colors, the natural and the dyed black. I think that would be a fabulous next thing to do. And but as you said, getting any one new yarn into the spinnery, you have to have huge minimums.
Yeah.
And so I'll wait patiently, but I do want a black here. I think especially with a black, or you could use a black from another, from Shelter, for example.
Yeah.
I think it would be gorgeous for granny squares.
Yes.
Just amazing. Be really beautiful.
And it's not a surprise that Church Mouse is asking for black and white.
Right.
With
right.
your black and white logo and your black and white boxes back there and your black door on the shop.
Yeah. Well, sadly, I think the doors are still black, but that's another shop now. We closed the bricks and mortar almost exactly a year ago, and we're coming up for our company Church Mouse 21st anniversary. We closed almost to the day of our 20th, but we're glad to still be here and still doing this. And the black and white floor, it was always a key piece. So we said we were going to do a little bit of brainstorming on what else you could do with this.
Yes.
You could double it like you did with some of your Shelter projects, to pick two tones and marl them.
Yeah, that would be really, really nice, subtle marl.
Very chunky because it's
a tone pair, but you'd probably be knitting at a really solid, chunky gauge. You could get maybe 3 stitches to the inch if you were holding it together and get a nice fabric.
Yeah.
So we've done a lot with, so the raglan pattern that we came out with, that I designed for the yarn is, so we've got a bunch of people in our office that have knit them. My mom's knit one, a bunch of other people in our kind of local community who've had access to the yarn have knit one. People have used it as a blank canvas for so many things. We've had a couple people who have done kind of bigger color block stripes with multiple colors. We've had people doing really thin, like single row or 2 row stripes with the 2 tones of a same color. So you're getting this kind of tonal stripe.
Yeah.
The one sweater that Jen, our pattern production director, knit, I have a picture of it here and I'll share that if I can. She did a stripe here. Can you see this?
Oh, yeah.
And what's really cool about, so she knit with the baseline gray, the gray color, and then the lighter of this bright teal color called vacay. And what's really, really cool about this when you stripe them is it looks like an overlay. It almost looks like you painted a stripe on top, because that heather yarn is consistent. That kind of heathery texture is consistent over the whole, but you get these bright strips, almost like you were looking through a color to the gray. Right. So we love when Jen started knitting this, we were all like, wow, it just has this glowing quality that's unique because there's sort of this textural harmony behind the color and then the color on top. So many different ways you can play around with those colors coming together.
I've also been thinking about maybe doing something, I don't know, a nice wide scarf or something with multiple colored stripes, and making the predominant stripe the overtone, and then maybe doing just a couple of rows of the undertone. And would it start to look dimensional? Would it start to have a bit of a pleat
Mhm.
to it where you go light and dark? I don't know. And could you enhance that by maybe doing a little bit of increase, decrease and give it that kind of accordion? I don't know. Haven't played
That'd be
with it yet. Yeah.
that'd be really cool. And the other thing that you kind of touched on, and we can also see in the yarns behind you, some of the colors are a closer contrast and some of them are further away. And
Yeah.
this is completely due to whatever that base dye color is. And so one of the learnings that I had when making the yarn is the color has to be a certain brightness and a certain lightness in order to work on both. And so there were a lot of colors that were really, really beautiful, but they were a little too dark. Like once you got past a certain value with that base color, the overtone and the undertone got too close. So we had one color in the palette that did make it that I was so tied to that I kind of forced it through, even though it's a little bit more low contrast, which is that top left color, Hollyhock. It's like a bright magenta. That was one that you'll see
Yeah.
if you compare it to the bottom right corner,
Yeah.
the colors, those blue colors, you can see more of a difference between the light and dark than up there.
Yeah.
But when you're combining, maybe 4 or 6 colors, it is a nice tool to have some of the tone pairs that are more high contrast and some that are lower contrast. It just gives you more to play with.
Mhm. Well, I want a palette that's all the discarded undertones. Get right on that.
You would like that.
Yeah, I would. One of the other things I was thinking about trying with this pattern, so being the tweed stitch, it's a slip stitch pattern. So you knit a row and then you do a knit slip with the yarn in front, knit slip with the yarn in front. So you get the same kind of little lines like floats as you do in linen stitch, for example. And I was thinking I would love to see how we could get the little blips, the little lines to all be in the lighter colors so they would kind of stand out on the fabric. So I was trying, 1 row, is it 2 rows? And then I realized, no, you'd actually have to do a little combination of tweed stitch and color work. And you'd have to carry the float yarn, the brighter one, as a second color and pull it to the front. Do all the knitted stitches, be the undertone and all of the floats be the overtone. So I'm going to play with that too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I also did a little bit, I don't have it with me, but a little bit of playing with it on a nice big canvas to do a little Bargello. It made me really think about that kind of tonal flame stitch kind of thing. And I do think the yarn did not seem to wear that much pulling through the canvas. I mean, usually you try to do fairly short pieces so that it doesn't get worn out by the time you've done a few stitches, but I think the structure of it is keeping it really, really nice, but the puffiness of it is filling the blanks because your stitches are going vertically. So theoretically you can see the column of the canvas itself, but this just sort of fills in beautifully. So I'm excited about that. And I also want to play with some kind of just crewel work embroidery, either on a garment or on a big piece of. I have some wonderful, really rustic linen. It's like burlap, but it's made of linen. So I think that would be beautiful.
It'd be gorgeous.
On too. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the structure and also the fact that this is a little bit of a longer staple length in wool is one of the reasons why when you're pulling that embroidery through, it's holding together better than maybe another woolen spun you've tried. Yeah, I think that's true. Any other ideas? I've got
Oh, John has some questions. Oh, what do you have?
I've got just something I'm playing around with. You won't really be able to see it, but one of the things I'm playing around with is mixing pairs of colors together and, taking 4 colors and playing around with them and just thinking of different ways to stripe them together and have vertical elements and horizontal elements. It's nothing to see right now, but just to show you that there's a lot of fun ways to mix these colors together. And I kind of go back and look at stitch patterns that I never gave a second thought to, but now with a new yarn that has this kind of color relationship, it kind of has me reassessing some stitch patterns that maybe weren't interesting, but now with this kind of a tool to work with, become a little bit more enticing.
Right, right, right. And I do think a lot of these would be wonderful as little pops in color work with shelter.
Yeah,
Just,
absolutely.
and maybe even stitch them in afterwards, you know,
Yeah,
really
yeah.
a lot of fun. Yeah.
I see we have some questions.
Yeah.
How does shelter compare to tones?
Yes, and we started to talk about this and made a left turn, how shelter and tones compare.
So we have hundreds of patterns over a decade for shelter. And when we were talking about making this yarn, we thought, well, let's definitely make sure that the yarn is interchangeable gauge wise, because then we have all these great patterns for people to work with from day one. Mm-hmm. And so we've done a lot of cable and texture patterns in shelter over the years. So those would be the patterns that I would really suggest people would try with this yarn, because it will just amp all of that up even more. I showed you some of these cable swatches that we have, but a lot of the classic cabled sweaters and cable accessories that we have in shelter look so good in this yarn, and mm-hmm. and also just new colors to see them in as well, or playing with how you might combine colors. So one of the things we've had people in our office doing is then knitting a shelter pattern with tones, but they might trim the cuff, the hems, and the ribbing at the neck with the undertone, and the main sweater's the overtone, or finding ways to add a little bit of color play into a pattern that was originally knit in a solid. That's another way we've been playing around with it at work. But there's a question here I see if tones would work for synths. Synth is one of our recent shelter pullovers. It'd be a great pattern for it, actually. I think that's a really good pattern fit for the new yarn. Lori asked, one of our gray swatches features a squiggly cable down the middle. Is that from any of your patterns? None of these are from any of my patterns yet. These were possible future pattern ideas that I've been swatching with the yarn to see what speaks to me and what wants to become a sweater. So the answer to that is no, or at least not yet.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I noticed, and you've got some strands there, but when you first introduced shelter to me, I think it was still in, I don't even think you'd done any of the colors yet, but you did this. And it was, test. Yes. And it was just like, it took my breath away how resilient and stretchy that is. And so I was wondering, because it's denser, would tones have that? And can you show us the stretch test in tones?
It does. Yeah. We love the stretch test at BT, because we want all of our yarns to have that talk back.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is a strand, and there's a good amount of bounce that pulls itself back. The 3-ply structure, anytime you're adding plies to something, if you're getting up to 4, 5, 6, it's going to make that spring back even more and more. Yeah. The fiber itself also has to do with that. If you're starting with a wool that has a lot of crimp in it naturally, if you were to look at the wool fiber and see those little squiggly kind of squiggle shapes to the wool, that has a lot of crimp. That's
every fiber
built-in elasticity, like the actual material you're starting with already has a little bit of that. And then if you enhance that through the way that you spin the yarn, you get a yarn that really has some nice responsiveness. And I think that most of the people in the virtual room right now are obviously knitters, so we all kind of know that little bit of stretch makes all the difference when you're working with a yarn. If you've ever worked with something on the opposite extreme, like a linen yarn or a full cotton mercerized yarn, you really feel it in your hands after a while. And these yarns, you could knit for days, and you're never going to kind of have that fatigue.
High pleasure quotient, right?
Yeah, and you get a little bit of that even translating into the finished fabric as well.
Yeah.
That feel.
I was fascinated when you described kind of, the 2-ply, they're side by side, so they're parallel, they're flat, whereas the
3 is a triangle.
The 3-ply is a triangle, and so it becomes more round. That just never really quite occurred to me, that the nature of 3-ply is round and not square.
Yep. Yeah. And if you think about like a 4-ply is a square.
Yeah.
you know, 4 corners. A 5-ply throws it off and you get sort of this hexagonal shape going on. So
Mhm.
the number of plies affects the shape of the cylinder, and
Yes.
that actually affects the stitch definition of the yarn as well.
Mhm.
I think maybe Clara Parks used the example of a 3-legged stool. Like, think of how a 3-legged stool is sturdy versus a 2-legged stool. And how much
Yeah.
the more legs you have on a stool, the more structure and sturdiness you have in the sitting.
Interesting. Huh. Well, I think we covered a little bit about the contrast between the 2 yarns. Love them both. And I can't wait to see what comes next. But we've of course talked way longer than I intended on those topics. And so we had on the agenda, to talk a little bit about kind of your story, where you came from, how you came from, a little boy in the Northwest to Brooklyn Tweed and then back to Portland. And is there a like 5-minute version of that?
Let's find out.
Okay.
Yes, I'm a Washington native. I grew up in Puyallup, outside of Tacoma, and had a very suburban existence, and loved, had a really great family situation growing up in a house of handmade, which I now very much see how that has affected my life in massive ways.
Mhm.
Always was a very creative child, very interested in music, very interested in art. I'm the youngest of 3 boys, and my mom only got one child who really was interested in the same thing she was interested in. So before I was in school, I was either listening to classical music records and dancing around the house, or I was asking my mom to teach me how to crochet and knit and macrame, and pretty much any sort of knot or string thing always has appealed to me ever since I was little. I had one of those little spool knitter
Oh,
things,
yeah.
and knit an I-cord that I'm sure, an acrylic I-cord that is probably 50 feet long somewhere up in my parents' attic. But
Yeah.
so knitting and fiber and color and texture and all those things were online in my brain from the very beginning.
Mhm.
And but I really did that a lot when I was younger, before I was in school, and unfortunately got to school and thought, oh gosh, maybe these are not things little boys are supposed to do, and was harmfully socialized maybe to kind of put some of those interests on the shelf for a while. And when I was in college, I had a friend who was a knitter, and she's still a very, very close friend of mine. She lives here in Portland. She's a big Brooklyn Tweed knitter as well. And she knit me something when I was a sophomore in college, and I hadn't really thought about knitting in a really long time. And the minute I saw that, I thought, I want to do this. I want to learn how to do this, and I want to learn how to make my own clothes. So she retaught me how to knit, although my body remembered how to knit. My hands
Yes.
remembered a lot of that, even from 15 years prior.
Mhm.
And I was an art student. I was a painting student, and knitting and yarn just started being this growing thing on the side that really felt like it talked to a lot of the things that I did in the fine arts field as a student, with my photography and graphic design and painting, all the things that I was interested in then. But yarn just was this thing that just sat right alongside it in my personal life. And when I graduated from college, I went to University of Puget Sound in Tacoma and studied art there. It's a small liberal arts college. It was a great experience. But when I graduated, I knew I wanted to move to New York and have a experience of living in a big international city. And I always told my mom I wanted to live in New York when I was a little kid. So I guess
Really?
there was
Wow.
something that stuck there.
Mhm.
And so I moved, much to my family's fear, because I had no career prospects and definitely no money. And it was, looking back, kind of a impulsive decision in a way. But I did okay. I got a job, and I started looking for knitting opportunities in New York because I didn't know anyone there. And it started to be a way that I could build some community there with a local yarn store. And I started my blog, which I called Brooklyn Tweed, because I was living in Brooklyn, and Tweed is my obsession. So never thought too much about it. I'd never thought it would become a name of
A
a
brand.
company.
Yeah. Yeah.
But also by the time I did start the yarn project, it felt like the right thing to call it because people already sort of were following me with that that name. And so I really started out as a knitter who was designing myself things that I liked. I couldn't find a lot of patterns for men that I liked, and very many things that kind of felt like me. So my blog for the first 3 or 4 years was just me knitting for myself mostly, and using it as an opportunity to pursue my photography regularly, have something to photograph and share imagery with people and make beautiful pictures.
And I think you brought spinning in as well to your blog, didn't you?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
I learned to hand spin kind of in public on my blog. I had never done it before, and just the way I'm a learner. I love learning. I love kind of going deep with something new that I've never learned before. So when I started getting into knitting and then started designing for myself, I really got curious about yarn itself. Like, why do some yarns behave this way and why do some yarns behave that way? And so I started hand spinning and learning about that. The things we've been talking about, how many plies will affect it, how tight the twist is, how different wool fibers or animal fibers behave being hand spun. And making yarn in a mill is essentially the same as hand spinning. You're just at a bigger scale and better consistency of everything, but the concepts, the physics of it all are the exact same. So it translated very well. And I ended up getting some more and more requests within the industry to work as a designer, either for magazines or other yarn companies. And I'm also a very independent person. I really love my freedom. I really love being able to feel like I've got place to explore in my life. And when I started getting involved more with the knitting industry at large, I just had this feeling of, I want to do something on my own. I want to do something that feels like me. I want to do something that is a avenue for self-expression. And kind of, I saw this as an opportunity to use a lot of the skills that I had and enjoyed, but put them together. So I did a little bit of work for some of the bigger magazines, like Interweave and Vogue Knitting, and also realized that there wasn't really a sustainable business model there. Like, I couldn't make a living doing that. But I also felt like there were a lot of people who valued those things. And was there a different way that I could be designing and selling my design work to people directly? And it kind of grew from there. I started publishing patterns online on my website on Ravelry. Ravelry had just started, and that was also a new way for me to make some money as I was starting out. And then I started working on a yarn project with a yarn company, and they wanted me to kind of put my name on some yarns for them. And as I started learning about the process, I had that feeling come up again of like, I think I could do this on my own. And I want to do it on my own because I don't like having the constraints of someone saying, well, this color doesn't sell, so you can't make 5 reds, or this yarn is too scratchy. We feel like our customer's not going to want it. There was already too many constraints that had me making compromises about something that I didn't agree with. I felt like, no, the yarn that I'm trying to make for you guys is the yarn that I don't see. It's the one that I want. And so that was where I started with Shelter. And that was not a plan of, I'm starting a yarn and knitwear design company. It was, I'm going to make a yarn and have that experience and hopefully have a avenue for people who are interested in this very, very small scale thing through the readership that I had built up through my blog. And that was kind of the first domino in a totally life-changing shift for me, which as I'll be really honest, this, where I'm standing today, wasn't a vision that I had 10 years ago. It was really more organic. It was, okay, people like this, I like this, I'm going to do it a little longer and see what happens, and then maybe do it a little longer and see what happens. And that was the first 5 years of Brooklyn Tweed. It was really having more demand than I knew how to handle. You guys were a part of that. We only knew how to even make and fund enough yarn to be able to get it into like 10 shops in the whole world. And also my life as a creative, independent, bohemian artist living in a tiny little studio apartment in New York, and then sort of being thrust into this world of having to know how to produce things and plan things and start a small business. And it was very, very hard, but also I was very intrigued by another form of learning, something that I could learn and teach myself. And hopefully do it well enough to kind of build up over time.
Yeah.
And when we, about 4 years in, or 3 years in, I hit a point where it was like, this is either I got to go for this or stop, because I'm kind of in this middle place of not having the creative time that I want, but also not having the skills or the help that I need to take it any further. And that's when
That's a very common phase in a small business.
Yeah. And that's at the exact same time my husband Luigi was having sort of a career crisis of his own. He was a traveling opera singer. He was traveling all over the world. We were apart half of the year, and he was like, this is a career I always thought I wanted, but it's not the lifestyle that I want. And I was like, I need help. I want to do this thing, but I don't feel like I can do it without someone I really trust and someone who's bringing another skill set in. And so when he joined me full-time at Brooklyn Tweed in 2013, and that was really a massive shift in just the whole mentality of what we were trying to do. And 2 years later, we moved out of New York and moved everything back to Portland. And
Yay.
I would say that's really where like kind of a big shift happened for us. The business we had set up on the East Coast was very much a tree that kind of just grew. However, we didn't prune it at all. It just grew how it needed to grow and became a little bit unsustainable for us. And we thought, if we're going to commit to this, let's do it in a place that we could see doing it for a long period of time, and a city that's a little more conducive to having a creative small business.
Also, your brothers
are
Northwest. Your brothers are there.
Family.
Yeah,
my family's here in Portland, and I had been in New York for 10 years. And the big joke in New York speak is like, if you hit 10 years, you're there forever. And
you just got out in time.
We were not quite comfortable with that. We were like, we love it here and we love a lot of the things, but it just doesn't feel like the place we want to be forever.
Yeah.
And I certainly missed the lifestyle of the Northwest and the nature and just the pace. Missed all of that, and it felt like
it's a gentler.
And it's been a great fit for Brooklyn Tweed. We've found some amazing people that have been on our team for 5+ years now who just get it. They get what we're trying to do, and we're able to provide them a living wage in a city rather than we would have never been able to do that in New York. So that's been a really cool development.
Well, it's been when I first met you, we were kind of put together by mutual friends. When we first met, I think Brooklyn Tweed was either in development, but it wasn't on the shelf yet. And so I'm really glad we became friends just before the yarn came out so we could have some. But it's been really lovely for me to watch you develop both creatively and as a business person. I think one of the things I've really treasured about our ongoing friendship is being able to talk sort of owner to owner, and also being able to talk about what it's like to work with your spouse, and also just watching you develop as a business person as well. For the longest time, you also did teaching. And now I love what you've done with that to reach more people. I always watch your video tutorials on YouTube. I think there's some of the best out there. I learn something from you every time. And I think that's a brilliant way to extend and generously share what you know without having to travel. I've just really appreciated also the authenticity and ethics with which you've built your company. And I just can't wait to see where you go. I mean, and it could be anywhere. I mean, obviously, over the course of this conversation, you're a photographer. I mean, that was why we first talked, actually. We needed a photographer for our patterns. And so you kindly did that for us twice a year for, I don't know, 8-9 years, maybe.
Long time.
And really helped us develop as well. That collaboration did a lot to help us build our company as well. So gosh, it's 11:30. 90 minutes. 90 minutes. I know. I'll call you back. But it has been so lovely having, knowing that this whole gang of like-minded people has been hanging out here with us. And I'm so glad that everybody came. And I hope we'll get to do this again.
Can
Yeah,
you show
would love
the
to.
one again?
Can I show? Oh, John says,
Oh, Jared and Kit.
show the coupon
It's in the
again.
chat too.
It's in the chat, and don't forget to get your $10 back for attending. And
Any questions
Golly.
to John?
yes, if you have questions, send them to john@churchmouseyarns.com, and whatever questions have been unanswered, we'll get to them. And gosh, I wish I could see you soon.
Me too.
Really looking forward to that. So
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's sat with us for 90 minutes and listened to us chat.
Yeah, it's been a lot of
It's an
fun.
honor.
It's been a lot of fun. And now I'm going to go knit. How about you?
Me too. It's Saturday.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Thanks, Jared.
Thanks,
See you
everybody.
soon.
Thanks, Kit.
Bye.
Bye.